Good evening, everybody. I'm Dan McCarthy,
And I'm Brian Saga.
and we'd like to welcome you to another episode of the Functional Fighters podcast.
This is our podcast about martial arts as it relates to self defense, practical applications, theory, history, applicability in the world. As always, we are trying to make everyone a better martial art.
Absolutely. And I think that the topic tonight goes very much in line with that because this topic is really an integral part of being um, a complete martial artist. In days past, in the martial arts, you could go into a school that specialized in a particular thing. They did stand up, or they did grappling, or so on and so forth. They did weapons. Um, but if your goal is to be a good self-defense practitioner, you have to have the whole repertoire. And tonight's specific piece we're talking about is ground survival. So that's definitely an important part of the idea here.
Yeah, certainly. And I will add to that too that, over time, there have been fads in the martial arts. I'll use that term uh, broadly at this point. In terms of what's popular and what's hot. And I would say ground fighting systems, ground fighting training, probably the hot thing right now, martial art. So,
Yeah, that's true, Brian. The fitness world is the same. Um, every every decade, or maybe every 15 years in fitness, there's the new hot thing, right? And you can throw out all kinds of buzzwords like Taibo, um, P90X, Shanti's systems. You can do all that, and you'll find these trends. And that's true in the martial arts as well. Yeah. So ground grappling has been one of the more recent ones, thanks to Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and the Gracies.
well, and I think even, you know, more immediately than that, and certainly they are the architects of the taken away from what brought it to the public's attention from my perspective, and I'm sure other people a different it is the influence of MMA, right? We put
Yeah.
MMA on TV, the UFC and the other systems that came before and after them, or the other circuits that came before and after got got it right out in front of everybody, right? Even people who would never have considered setting a foot in a martial arts school before, right? All of a sudden have Gracie Jiu-Jitsu or some form of it right in their face all the time.
Hmm. Right. Yeah. So, I think the first thing, and I'm going to put you on the spot with this one, Brian, is I'd like for you to be able to tell our listeners, um, why are we saying ground survival? What's the difference between ground survival and ground grappling? What why don't we just say ground grappling?
You've turned the tables on me, Dan. Normally, I
Yes, I
make
did.
you define everything in this podcast, and now you've done it to me. Excellent.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think in terms of yeah, we can definitely set the stage there, right? So when I talk about ground survival, we're talking about just that. Like I'm in the middle of a fight and find myself on the ground and I need to survive that situation. Literally, I need to survive that situation. Um, I think ground grappling is a subset of that, right? I mean, certainly there are um, martial arts systems and there are sporting circuits and different things that have different rules and acting competition where you are essentially fighting on the ground all the time, right?
Right.
So that is a, I guess I would say, subset or an offshoot of ground survival.
Sure.
um, and I think they're different in that one. can be viewed as sort of a primary skill set, right? And one is viewed as, a piece of a larger set that makes a complete self-defense.
Right. And in this case, that being if you've got that subset of techniques you would use on the ground in a larger self-defense situation that also might have encountered a knife, uh,
Mhm.
or maybe stand up brawling as a part, another component of what's going on.
Right, absolutely. And I think it's worth noting too that you just like our self-defense system is mainly a stand up and fight type of system, right?
Yeah.
Um, you can have 100% complete martial arts system where your primary objective is to dominate someone on the ground, right?
Sure.
You may have different opinions. We may have different opinions on what's more effective in the long run than another one, but it, it it's on a spectrum, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Just like we've talked about before, you can have too much of a good thing and you can have not enough of a good thing, right? And
Yeah.
ground survival or ground fighting techniques are certainly that logic still applies to them in martial arts for self defense.
Yeah. 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 I just finished today. I'm gonna tangent for a second here. I just finished today, um, reading the course manual for the ISSA's tactical uh, um, tactical strength and conditioning specialist training. As a personal trainer, um, for those that don't know, it's a requirement in my field to do continuing education units and recertify every 2 years. So it is a normal part of my function as a personal trainer that I have to continue to go through education on a regular basis. And one of the things I opted for this time around was to go ahead and do this course because I thought it blended really well into my life as a martial arts instructor as well. To look at, well, what is the best way to condition somebody who is a law enforcement officer to make sure that they don't get hurt when they're performing their job, or if somebody is part of a tactical unit like the Navy SEALs or something. How do you make sure that that operator is always in the proper condition to keep them uh, uh, performing at a high level and also at a low level of injury?
Mhm.
So it's all got to fit into that pragmatic side of they've got to be able to operate in their job. Um, and same thing with when we start talking about ground survival. We're talking about the skill sets that somebody uses to be able to fight on the ground. We're not specifically talking about Brazilian Jiu Jitsu or Greco Roman wrestling or things like that. We're on a much broader scale because those things can be used to defend yourself on the ground. Absolutely, 100%. They can be. Those can be effective things to fight with in a real world situation.
Absolutely,
We're
yeah.
we're just not we're not pigeonholing ourselves into that's how you do it, is this system or that system. Um, it really is just about us looking at it through that concept of if you're on the ground, and we're not talking about in the octagon. We're not talking about in a padded surface with bright lights and a referee. We're talking about on the asphalt and maybe broken glass, maybe rain and gravel, and maybe no witnesses, or maybe multiple attackers. We're talking about that kind of a situation, is how we categorize this as ground survival versus ground grappling.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the things I want to make sure we talked about in this episode was what are the drawbacks? Like people see, all these tough guys in the octagon and other places dominating each other and doing
Oh
all these
yeah.
cool manipulations and chokes and joint locks and all that stuff. But why is that not a complete system by itself? And I think you touched on a few key things there. one, conditions in the ring are relatively controlled, right?
Yep.
Like again, the mat is always pretty much the same.
Yep.
You pretty much know what's going on there. There's only two of you in there at any given time. Um, you know, the one thing we can get into the physics of it all, but the one thing you don't have on the ground is mobility,
Mm.
right? The other thing you don't have on the ground is leverage in the same way that you do when you stand. Um, so
Ground effect is very different.
yeah,
That's what that's called, is ground effect.
right, exactly. And I'll talk a little bit more about that uh, later here, I'm sure. But it can't. In my mind, it's just not. It can't be the only thing right? You
Yeah.
you you know, there's a lot of advantages. Like there's a lot of good things to it because like we talk about in the martial arts a lot. Like, the likelihood of you getting in a fight in the street with someone else who is a martial artist very low,
Yeah.
right? Because even if we broaden the definition of martial artist to anybody who ever wrestled in junior high or high school or something like that, right?
Totally. Well,
Um,
I would say that's a valid definition in my opinion.
sure, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
but but anyone who has any sort of fight training and of any type, right? It is way less than 10% of the population,
Yeah.
right? So, um, it's possible. So there's some guy who, I mean, there's a few sociopaths out there, right? Guys who want to go dominate the world and, they go get some fight training or they're a boxer or they're this or they're that. So it can happen. I'm not saying it won't
Sure.
happen,
Sure.
but chances are it's not, not likely.
Yeah.
On top of that, there's going to be a few people who are just they can naturally throw a punch. They had a lot of brothers growing up, right? Or whatever. They fought a lot. I
I
mean,
got I got cousins like that.
yeah, exactly. You can start to expand. You start to get into like some archetypes of the type of people that you may get in a fight with, right? And one of the big advantages any martial artist from any system has over some random person off the street is you have knowledge that they don't have. You have training that they don't have. You have practice and experience that they don't. And um, that pays off a lot in ground fighting, right? Like you take someone who's had 1 month of classes in ground fighting and you knock them down and fight them on the ground and you've had none and they will roll
Eat
all
you
over you. Yeah,
alive.
they will because
Yeah.
I mean, we're generalizing a bit. We could really go down a rabbit hole here, but it makes a huge difference. You stand up and fight against someone who, anybody can throw a punch, anybody can
Yep.
get lucky landing a punch, right? So the difference is smaller there.
Yeah.
But definitely, you need to know. I mean, the more you know, just like they always used to flash up on us back when those specials were still a thing, right?
I'm glad you thought of it too. Yep.
Yeah, the better off you are. But also, it can't be a complete. Again, you have to have some other stuff to go along with it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just based on what you said there, what is the key factor that makes somebody who's got month one of ground fighting versus month one of stand up fighting so much more dangerous? That's simple. It's mobility. A fight that is up on the feet is way more mobile, and once it is in that clash that is body to body on the ground, you ain't going anywhere. It's and so if you have that level of skill set that you've trained, that person can't get away from you easily, at least not as easily as if you both were standing up, so that
Right.
makes
You
that makes a
can't get
huge
away from it
difference.
easier, right? I think that's
Right.
another way to look at it is,
Yeah.
and I don't. I'm at risk potentially here of waxing somewhat philosophical about about the martial arts, but when you're a stand-up fighter in a system like Hapkido, like ours, where you work on balance disruption, you work on joint manipulation. Um, one of the things that one of the things you come to understand, I guess, is that your ability to manipulate another human being is based on couple of key factors. Um, one of those one of those factors is your connection to the ground, right? And the other key factor is the not to try not to make this be an hour-long conversation by itself here, but another way you could look at it is the distance of your center of gravity from the ground has a lot to do with how much leverage and energy you
Leverage.
can apply to someone else,
Yeah.
right?
Leverage.
So, we can get it like then their connection to the ground and their distance to their center of gravity to the ground, all these things kind of start to play in. But my point is when you're standing up, you can manipulate someone else's center of gravity and its distance. You can use all this leverage. And that is what when you dig into the real physics of it, right? That is what you're coming down to when people say size doesn't matter,
Right.
right? Because it doesn't really matter if I weigh 100 pounds and you weigh 300 pounds. What matters is how I'm manipulating the relationship between our centers of gravity, right? And I can do that effectively on a much larger person, right?
When you're standing.
When I'm standing,
Yeah. When
right?
you're standing, you
Now,
can.
when I go to the ground, the distance between my center of gravity and the ground is zero. So I no longer can employ that advantage. So
Yeah.
now, how do I apply leverage? Do it with my body weight and do it with my muscular strength,
Yeah.
right?
Which means that the bigger guy has a
Huge
decided advantage
advantage.
on
Right.
the ground. So what may have been a real detriment to you in stand up, which is somebody's got 60 pounds on you, and you can see how that's a bit of a problem standing up. Once you get to the ground, it's killer is what it is. It grows exponentially how dangerous that person becomes.
Yeah. I mean, I practice with my wife all the time. I won't say how much more I weigh than she does, but
That's a good call, but she's tiny.
it's a fair amount, and
Yep.
I'm also like at least a foot taller than right.
Yeah.
And when we're standing up, I mean, we hold our own against each other, right? When we're on the ground, I can do whatever I want,
Yep.
you know, and
Yep.
it
Absolutely.
now she's trained, so that's not totally true, but the difference is noticeable,
Yeah.
right? How much how her is different. And even me, like I have a student who's about my height, but he's a really big guy.
Hmm.
And I mean, I've been training for 15 years more than he has, and it is,
Still.
it is a struggle.
Yeah.
Man, is it a struggle for me against the ground again? It's just so,
Well, yeah, that from my own perspective, when I was first really new to the idea of fighting on the ground, from a systemized way. I rolled around in the ground in like schoolyard brawls, gotten the crap beat out of me. But I don't. I mean, when I actually had a chance to learn something.
right.
Um, one of my instructors was actually going through the police academy at the time. She was experiencing police academy training, so she was fit as a fiddle. You know what I mean? When you go through the police academy, that's real. It's just like military boot camp. It's really rough and tumble. And so she was fit as a fiddle. She was tough anyway. She had a fourth degree black belt in Taekwondo. She did some kickboxing, as well as that. She'd done some Hapkido, and she was working on becoming a cop. She was tough little spitfire. Um, and yet here I was, this young man, boy, who was significantly bigger than her height wise, and maybe slightly weight wise. Maybe there was, it's hard to say because I was an extremely, extremely skinny kid at 6'1" at that point in time, 17 years old. I weighed about 130 pounds. So, and I would not venture to say how much she weighed either, but I'm sure I had a weight advantage on her at least, at least 20 pounds. I
Mm.
think was pretty reasonable to be able to say that I had 20 pounds on her. Um, and just having that would allow me to be in a position where I could dominate on the ground if I got on top because I had the weight,
Yeah, right.
and I didn't know what I was doing even. I didn't know how to ground fight. So it was mostly that. It was mostly I'm going to pin you down to the ground, use my body weight, and use the fact that I have longer levers than you to kind of spider over you and make sure that you can't get me off of you because my legs are too long for you to make sure that they're pinned or whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, you can still, you can still learn a lot about ground fighting, close some of that gap, right? Because there
Yeah,
are techniques, tactics, tricks, different things you can do, right? That
yeah,
if
yeah,
you know them, you can do something the other person isn't countering with their weight or their size, right? I mean, so you
yeah,
can still close the gap with knowledge. That,
totally,
but um, you know, there are
totally.
limits to everything. I mean, like that that woman that you used in your example there, like as a trained fighter, she may want to know a lot about ground grappling because people fall on the ground a lot, or as a police officer, you put people on the ground a lot, and you may end up wrestling, right? I mean,
Yeah,
uh,
that especially.
yeah, right. So, but if that woman's going to walk up to someone who's bigger than her, her primary tactic is probably not going to want to be to take him down and start wrestling with him, right?
Right.
You want that. You need something else that you can do
Yeah,
for
yeah.
control, which is where a different type of martial arts training. And I don't know. I've never trained in a Gracie jiu-jitsu system. Um, I don't know how much actual stand-up fighting they teach. Uh,
Um,
some, but
well, and in all fairness, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu has grown beyond Gracie at this point in time too.
mhm,
So there might be, um, although 25 years ago, the only thing we heard about was the Gracies. There might be huge variations in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu by this point in time, in different groups that it would be unfair for either one of us to really state, well, this system does this, and because neither one of us has that level of experience. Although that might be something to tap um, our friend Mr. Bandanza about, see if he wants to come on and talk a little bit about it
oh yeah,
sometime in the
do that
future,
for sure.
because he
Yeah,
he he does have some knowledge there that he would probably be willing to lend to a couple of his friends. And um,
I know a significant number of the schools that I have seen around, at least the area that I are, they're much more focused on the MMA aspect of it.
yeah,
Right? So what
yeah,
you go in there and you see a lot of good training for chokeholds and this arm bars and figure fours, and
yeah,
triangle chokes and all that stuff, but you don't, know, it's all rules based. Well,
yeah,
you can't do this.
yeah, yeah,
No fingers, no wrists, no,
yeah,
which again, even that's pretty good ground fighting training. It's
yeah.
not complete,
But it's
but
better than nothing by far. I think one of the things that is also worth mentioning is, for anybody who is spending time in a ground grappling program, regardless of what their end result is, their end game they're playing for, whether it's street self defense or it is for the ring. If you've never experienced it, the level of conditioning that happens in ground fighting is much, much, much higher than is the kind of conditioning you get out of your average stand-up martial art. Now, I would take away from that statement I just made. Boxing is a different animal,
mhm,
and Muay Thai is a different animal. Both of those sports are very heavy into their conditioning and are amazing athletes. I'm talking about your average karate program or
right.
your average taekwondo program. Those guys are not as conditioned um, as your general ground grappler, just because there's, as Brian said, you don't have the same kind of benefit of leverage and mobility or on the ground that you do standing up. And so they spend a lot of time working on conditioning their endurance, and also their power, so that they can do explosive movement, um,
Yeah,
in order to
absolutely true.
really make things work.
You see on you go into schools like that, or you see guys around places wearing the ground grappling shirts, and a lot of them are pretty muscular looking guys, right? Why
Yep.
is that? Do Which is the cart and which is the horse? Do muscular guys go do ground grappling, or do ground grappling guys build muscle?
I'm
And
gonna say yes.
I mean, both can be true, but
Yeah.
I will say that, like, if you're the type of person who starts ground grappling and decides, "Yeah, this is really for me, like, I'm really gonna make this my martial art, I'm gonna do it," you will find yourself spending time in the gym, because
Yep.
at some point, you need the strength to be able to do the stuff, right?
Yep. Yep.
Again, that's part of how you're evening out. Like we talked about before, you've lost your leverage. Like you've given up the advantage that gravity or potential energy can do for you. You're making that up with your own strength. So
Yeah.
you will, like, just like, any other functional sport, right? Basketball players practice jumping higher, and baseball players practice, really work their core muscles so they can turn their upper body really fast, right? I mean, it's just like stuff you do to be better at the functional things you do. That's what it is for ground grappling. You got to put
Yeah.
muscle on. You got to
You
be
got to be able to do good hip extension, which honestly is usually a lot of powerlifting.
right. A lot
From
of
an actual behind the curtain. If you're if you want to work a lot on hip extension and bridging and things like that, then you're going to see somebody in the gym who's working on cleans and working on jerks and snatches and squats and deadlifts and things like that are
yeah,
really going to
functional.
play into that ground grappling game.
Yeah, the chest. They all have huge chests, and they all have huge backs.
Yep.
So you're trying to push someone off you, or you're trying to hold someone to you, right? So,
Yep.
those are big things. And that, the other, like, we've trained a lot of women over the years too.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that always sticks out in my mind. And I know, like, you can look at women who are just fantastic grapplers. Pretty much everybody knows who Ronda Rousey is. She was
Yeah.
an Olympic medalist wrestler, and then went into the ring and dominated there for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, even with all that skill and the strength that she has and all that stuff, like, if you put her up against an equally trained man of average size, it's going to be tough for her, right? I mean,
Not impossible.
not impossible, but
Not
tougher,
impossible, but
right?
it's going to be a challenge.
Just because that size does matter. And I mean, like,
We're
again,
talking equal
she's
skill,
a
just to
gold
make.
medalist, right? Yeah. So you're
Yeah.
talking about, like, or I don't know if she was a gold medalist, but she was at least a medalist in the Olympics, right? So you're talking
Yeah.
about her fighting that caliber of person. Like, if she was
Right.
the gold medalist and she had to go wrestle the male gold medalist, that would be a show to see, right? I mean,
Yeah.
but it's tough. And the average woman who walks in looking for some self-defense stuff, like I know this place that I try, there's jiu-jitsu classes going there all the time. There's two women there now, and a lot smaller than all the guys, right? So at some point, you just start to wonder, like, they're going to hit a limit.
Right.
From
Sure.
a self-defense standpoint, they can get their skill will continue to increase, but there will eventually be a guy who's just too big,
Too big.
right? And
Well,
that's just
y-
less. The guy has to be even bigger than that in a stand-up type of system. If you had
yep.
equal skill in stand-up arts, you can still have someone who's just bigger and faster and stronger than you. Can't overcome them with all your training. It can still
Yeah.
happen. It's just
Yep.
that size disparity and the skill disparity can be much larger, right?
Yeah. 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 It does make a bigger impact on the ground, although it does make an impact in the stand up world too. Yep. Yeah, totally. And it's going to be a matter of fact just with kind of the way things are, that if you get a guy who's 320 pounds, who has some experience, he's used to how to use that muscle that he has and that weight that he has to get what he wants. So, there's something to be said about that too. Yeah. So, when it comes down to talking about ground survival, um, the big thing to keep in mind is, um, when you learn technique, you have to be learning technique that is actually going to be applicable to your environment. Um, so, and here's an example I'd like to give basically is the idea of like the tap out armbar or something like that, right? That's not a great self defense technique on the ground. You see everybody do this in the UFC where they catch a hold of that arm and they lay back and they get the arm and they submit the other guy to get the guy to tap out and all that kind of stuff. um, that's a very dicey move in the real world. It's a very dicey move in the real world because you're talking about exposing yourself on the ground. Again, this could be asphalt. And it could be, there could be broken glass. You tying yourself up with this person. There's nobody is saying that this person is alone. Maybe
Yeah,
they have a
exactly. His friends
partner.
are running over. Now you're laying on the ground, right? What
Yeah.
are you gonna do? Tied, literally, your legs tied up with the other guy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
maybe somebody curb stomps you in the face while you're trying to go for this armbar, or whatever. Um, so whatever it is that you do learn to employ, regardless of whether it is choke or joint manipulation or attack points or just strike or whatever, has got to function with the idea of making you safe. And it's not about points. It's not about wins, losses. It's not about submission. I mean, a choke on the ground is a very, very valid technique in the self defense world, just like it is in the ring. But the difference there is you're not waiting for that person to tap out for you in a street situation. You're going to knock them out. It's not the question of do you tap or do I knock you out. You're gonna knock them out so that you can get out of there. That's what the choice you should make is.
right. You're still exposed during that period of time, and there's
Yeah.
other little things too. Like I remember I can't remember where, but somewhere along the line, one of the people who I was training ground survival techniques with, okay, normally, what do you see when you see somebody doing that lean back, that layback armbar, like you're
Yep.
talking, right? You got, one leg kind of across their midsection, you got the other leg kind of across their face, like in the in an uncontrolled environment, like a street fight type of environment. Like aside from everything you mentioned about, you might be laying on gravel or something really full or glass,
Painful.
whatever, right? Even just plain old concrete.
Yeah.
You know, your leg, you can't lay your leg across somebody's face like that because they're just gonna bite you, right? I mean, if you think some stranger that you're fighting in the street is about to break your arm, and the only thing you can think of to do is bite him, you're gonna bite him, right? They can't bite you in the ring, or at least they're not supposed to, right?
Well,
So just how
and
you execute the technique would be different. There's things you can do, right? So
yeah,
you can put your foot on their face. You can do different things. You can still do the technique. I'm not trying
you
to say,
lay your leg across their throat.
but there's a lot of, or yeah, if you got room to do that, you can do that way too, right? But even just how you would teach the technique in a self-defense real world scenario versus MMA style fighting would be different.
Yeah. Yep. And in the real world, a lot of the things that we like to do as equalizers are just not things you're allowed in the ring. Small joint manipulation is a great example of that. Um, so you'd be surprised the leverage you get from a finger lock. Fingers are very, very, very painful when somebody gets a hold and they start wrenching on a thumb or a pinky or something like that. And if they get a good position, it's very easy to break. So you can cause severe instantaneous pain. by just not even trying to control it and just grab it, snatch it, and break it. And you cause a lot of pain doing that. Or you can send a little bit, slightly more subtle message by a little bit of control to get them to move a specific way before you put yourself in a different position. A lot of times we use a finger lock as a method of putting us into a position for a choke, actually, because you get
Mhm.
a hold of somebody's finger and suddenly they start dancing in ways that they wouldn't normally,
Yes.
and they'll give you their neck. It's actually a lot easier than you would think.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's one of my wife's uh, favorite things to do when some big
Yeah.
guy comes up to her. Well, what if I did that? You know,
Okay.
yeah. This is
Come
what I
here.
would do. Right. Yeah. That's one
Yeah.
of the big myths in martial arts. You know, everybody's like, "Oh, well, I could figure out a way to make it so you couldn't do that technique." Right?
Yep.
Absolutely, that's true. You absolutely can.
Sure. Sure,
That's
you
why
can.
I know 100 other ones.
Yeah.
Right? So,
The what if game, and we could probably do a whole issue on just the what if game. But the what if game ultimately is one of those exercises in self defeat. Okay, students do this all the time. Students absolutely do this all the time. They want to play the what if game, and usually they have really good intentions when they do this. It's something that genuinely frightens them, and they want to spend some time looking at that because, well, wait a minute, I've been in this situation before in the real world, and it scares me. So what if this or what if that? Um, and the only thing that we try to get across as an instructor is self-defense happens way faster than what if. Self-defense is something that happens on such a fraction of a second scale, that when somebody watches you do a technique in the 10 to 20 seconds it took me to execute the technique while I taught the technique to my class, somebody can formulate an answer. Sure, you can. So can the rest of the world. That
mhm.
doesn't make you special. Okay. But I'm not going to take 15 to 20 seconds to execute the technique. I'm going to take 15 to 20 microseconds. Okay. And that's the difference there is the technique happens so fast and all it takes is that much time for me to make you be unaware of what's going on with a distraction or something like that. And the other thing is when you start to work on the self-defense game for real, when you start to practice these things, you start to learn what the tendencies of human beings are. So if I do a given technique, and let's keep this to the because we are talking about ground survival. Okay, so if if I put myself in a position to choke somebody on the ground, let's just take it from that stance, and I've found their back. I'm behind them, and I'm putting them into a rear choke. Um, there are only so many answers to that rear choke. It's not that there aren't answers. There absolutely are ways to respond to it that are effective.
Mhm.
Problem is I know those. Okay? Number
Well,
1.
yeah, right.
Yeah, number 1 problem is when somebody decides to execute one of those things, I already know all of them. Number 1. Number 2, I also have done a lot of work with a lot of people over the years that gives me a prioritized concept of which ones are most likely. If there's 5, there's 2 that are likely that somebody's going to come up with without the training, and the other 3 are things that people generally don't think of, without having been taught to do them.
Yeah. I mean, another way to say that that I've heard this said before is there is a point of no return after which a technique is just going to work, right? Like by the time, in your example, by the time you have your arm all the way around their neck and the other arm set in behind their head to really lock it down,
Hmm.
um, it's all but over at that point. I mean, there's still, the guy has what 3 to 10 seconds before he passes out. And there's still something that could happen there, right? But for the most part, like once it's set.
Under the assumption I'm doing the technique right.
Right, yeah,
Yeah, under the
exactly.
assumption that I've got the technique right, then yeah, that's
It's
where we're at.
pretty much that. Same thing with just a basic arm bar. There is a point at which the only way to get out of an arm bar is to allow your arm to break,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
There are a number of things you can do before it gets that far to get out of the arm bar, but, you know,
You have to know them
you have to know them.
and
You
you have
have
to
to
react quick enough.
react quick enough. That's exactly right. You have to get there before they get there, right? You have
Yep.
to execute your counter technique before the point of no return. So, and that's
Yeah.
true for every single thing. I mean, it's just how it is, right?
Yeah.
Um, the
And part of the fun of like ground is that when you start dealing with somebody who's an expert at that, um, you know, I hear this analogy thrown out all the time, the anaconda or the boa constrictor, right? You know, those guys, they wait for you to do something stupid. Um,
Mhm.
the ground game is very, very patient if you decide to grapple with somebody. Me, myself, and I, when I start talking about ground survival, I'm not talking about grappling, but that's because I'm not predispositioned towards that as a mode of fighting. I don't like to do it. I have skill sets in there, but I will be doing things to get out of a grapple. I will be breaking ankles. I will be breaking knees. I will be striking the groin, and so on and so forth. I'll be doing things like that as opposed to what I mentioned earlier about trying to get into a rear choke or something like that. That's just not my way of fighting somebody on the ground, even though I know I could do it. Um, but when you deal with that person who has that as their kind of their operating mode, their modus operandi, when that's what they like to do, they're just like a freaking boa constrictor. They wait for you to do something stupid. They allow you to do it so that they can tie you up even tighter, and they just
Mhm.
hold on to you until you're exhausted. And that yet again comes in that whole conditioning aspect of the ground fighting systems.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, um, like we've talked about several times, the the knowledge is not common knowledge, and it is way less intuitive than just starting to throw punches, right?
Yeah.
Um, so, and I think, again, I'm not like the world's foremost historian on this, but from my journey through getting, finding out what the ultimate fighting was and watching, the evolution of that all the way up through, today's uh, prime time event type things is what allowed the Gracie system to take that over was nobody else had that knowledge, right? So they came in and were able to, um, you know, force everyone else to play their game, and they were the only ones who knew the rules,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So,
Literally.
it just took, yeah, exactly, literally, and so they just took that sport. It's more than a sport. It's whatever. I'll call it a sport for now. They took that whole genre over because they had the knowledge, right?
Yeah.
And it looked like it just dominated everything, right? And
Yeah.
it looked like it was better than everything, and in some
It
ways
was
it
it it
was,
was it was it was the smoke and mirrors effect, you know? I mean,
right?
they had the situation ripe, set up exactly the way they needed to look like the
Yeah,
ultimate fighting force on the planet. They did a good job of uh of really showing other fighters what they were lacking.
right,
And
exactly.
and they should be commended for that. Very honestly, they should be
Yeah,
commended for that
absolutely,
because
absolutely.
you know and it reinvented how we look at fighting in the ring and all that kind of stuff because everybody in that world changed their game because of that, so
Right.
you
Yes.
can't discount what they did.
No, an analogy that some people, may be more familiar with is in basketball, right? There were there was the first team to figure out that um, if you could make 30% of your 3-point baskets you would score on average more points than if you made 50% of your 2-point basket,
Yeah, and
right?
develop
Doesn't
their long game.
Yeah, it doesn't sound it's not intuitive. You think like I can make this shot one out of every 2 times I take it, or I can make that shot one out of every 3 times I make it. It sounds like, you know,
Yeah,
it,
which should I focus
right,
on?
right.
Right.
So one team figured out that, hey, I'm way better off shooting this 3 at 30% accuracy than I am trying to get all these 2s, at 50% accuracy because I'll get more shots, right?
Right.
You could take
You
you
don't
take
have to
you just
get as far down the court.
right, exactly. I don't, it's harder to get a 50% uh, success rate 2-point basket because you got to be close to the basket, right? Than it is to
Yeah.
get a 3-point shot, right? So
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
somebody just figured this out and they started to dominate. And now that's a part of the whole NBA
That's
game.
that is
Right?
now a very viable strategy in
Yeah,
the NBA.
exactly. And every
Yeah.
team knows it and every team is doing it. And the playing field evened out again, right? So now, you saw this thing, you've seen times in the NBA, and some teams are still there, but based on skill sets and the players they have and all that stuff, they play different ways. But you can't win just that way anymore because teams know how to counter.
Right. Right.
And MMA is the same way.
Yeah.
There used to be fights that were like, oh man, if this guy gets the other guy on the ground, the fight's over. So that guy just like fought like crazy to make sure he never went down, right? And
Yeah.
you saw a lot of boring fights going on. And now um, everybody's got some basic skill set. So this one guy might be better at grappling, and the other guy might be better at striking. And they're both still trying to make the other guy play their game, but
Yep.
it's still a more level playing field than it used to.
I think I agree with that. I think UFC is way more interesting to watch nowadays. And I have a personal bias here because honestly, I don't like ground grappling. It's not something I enjoy watching as a sport. I'm not into wrestling or anything like that. So I find it very boring. I want to see somebody get hit. So that might
Yeah,
say something
right.
about me as a human being, and maybe it really does. But I want to see punches and kicks thrown, and I want to see somebody get their head rocked and all that kind of stuff. So I really enjoy that about watch. So I love to watch boxing. I think boxing's a lot of fun to watch. I've gone to several boxing matches in person just because I think boxing's really cool. Um,
Yeah, sure.
and I like
Nonstop action.
kickboxing and yeah. Maybe I just don't have the acumen or the sophistication for grappling. Maybe that's it. But I'm just a crazy Irishman who loves to see people get their heads rocked.
Yeah,
But
no, I know what
the thing is, um, I think across the board in MMA, everybody has leveled up so much that um, everybody has very similar skill sets, and now you've seen the return of the specialist. You see the guy who actually is a black belt in karate, and he can say that, and it brings something new to his game. You know, um, and so on and so forth. You see those guys who come in the ring and they've got the same training everybody else does, which comes down to Brazilian jiu-jitsu, wrestling, boxing, and Muay Thai. They're all running that same program, but then you get the guy who, in addition to that, uh, has a black belt in Taekwondo or something,
Mhm.
or judo or whatever, and so they have just a different touch of a perspective or whatever.
Yeah,
Um,
it's definitely gone through, um, you know, huge explosion in popularity, and like you said, like you're seeing it. I think you said it perfectly before. Like it showed a lot of people what they were missing, right?
yeah.
And now it's showing up in more places. But I think there's still some of that view that it's the best thing since sliced bread, and it certainly is a very good thing. But I would say
Yeah.
it's not the only thing either.
So, what do you think is probably from a ground survival standpoint? 'Kay, you teach it, I teach it. Um, what do you prioritize in teaching ground survival, knowing that you're gonna make it a point to teach it in your system, because as we said, we want to have a complete system for
Hmm.
self-defense. We don't want to neglect anything. But also knowing that ground survival is not your niche. It's not the thing that you're going to hit on above all else. What do you prioritize?
I like to show escapes, right? I mean, that's pretty much what we focus on. We do a minimum, I'll say a minimum compared to the rest of the extensive system that we teach, a minimum amount of ground grappling that focuses on like, all right, if they've landed on top of me, how do I get out of this? If they've landed in my guard, if they're on my side, we're all these we just try and put as many different situations as we can out there, and we look for escapes. And some of those escapes, can end different ways, right? They can end with us standing up and trying to fight again on our feet, and some of them can end up, with us in control on the ground.
Hmm.
And I do show everybody wants to know how to do that. Everybody knows
Yeah.
it's in the
Yep.
movies.
Everybody wants to know that armbar. We've
Not
all seen
MMA.
it.
Gotta show that one. We can show the triangle choke, that's another one everybody wants to know. How do I choke a guy on the ground? Well, certainly we can show you a couple of those. But um, by the time I introduce it in the system the way I teach it, like we have gotten the fundamentals of stand-up fighting pretty well ingrained in the student. Like how does my system how do I try and use my system to win, right? What's our strategy, right?
Yeah.
And our strategy is based on balance disruption, joint manipulation, leverage, those kind of things, right? So when I'm teaching ground grappling, I'm also teaching them, all right, this is why we don't focus on ground grappling, right? Because all of those things that are primary drivers of our strategy are a lot harder to apply on the ground,
Oh,
right? But I could end up here anyway. Still need to know, right?
yeah. Well, okay. Now let me take another piece of what you literally just said, because I think it's valuable knowledge. Um, and belt ranks are subjective, right? Okay. Probably if you're listening to this, you've got some martial arts experience and skill, but maybe you don't have a lot of experience outside of your own school yet. So let me just tell you right now that the belt ranks that are trained in a martial art are very arbitrary in nature. Um, Not every martial art teaches the same belt ranks. Not only that, but they don't always teach them in the same belt order. Um,
Oh yeah, the colors don't.
and yeah, they don't matter. Okay, they really don't. They're just a way for you to track your progress. It's perfectly okay for your school to have 6 color belts. It's perfectly okay for your school to have 2 color belts. It's perfectly okay for your school to have 12 color belts. And I don't care what those colors are and in what order they are. I don't care. It doesn't matter.
Right.
Okay, it is only a method of tracking your progress through a system. It's just a method of helping you to be able to gauge your learning process. And that's a good thing. Okay. It's a good thing that that exists. But taking that statement from your perspective, Brian, where are you starting to introduce in your curriculum? And so give me a timeline, because I just said belt rank
Yeah,
doesn't matter. So
sure.
student
So
starts day one and they've been training with you 6 months, 9 months, a year.
I mean, so by the time they have to demonstrate some ground grappling stuff for progression, it's been a year or a little bit longer.
Okay.
Now, the way I run my classes, we kind of spend the first part of class talking about whatever's on my mind or one of my, people give me ideas and stuff they want to work on. We work on
Yep.
it together. And if it's black belt technique, I mean, the whole class is working on it. I don't
Yep.
care. Right.
Yep.
So they've probably seen some of it sooner than that, but
Yeah.
I'm not asking them to really fully internalize it and demonstrate at a certain level of skill until a year or slightly longer.
Okay. Yeah, that's about the same for me. In terms of the skill sets that I have for my students, usually about a year, somewhere between 9 months and a year is when I'm going to say, okay, we're going to make this a primary focus for you in a limited fashion.
Mhm.
Um, and they may have seen it ahead of time, because I do my classes very much the same way you do. Well, we came up through the same place learning to teach, so there's a lot of similarities in the way that we kind of organize a class and all that kind of stuff. So somebody could walk in night one and we're doing defense versus the guard. That might be their very first night. But it isn't a primary focus of their training until later. And usually it's about that 9 months to 12 months. We go, okay, we're going to actually dedicate some serious time to this for now before we go any further with your stand-up training. We want to make sure that you can take a limited number of skills on the ground and get comfortable with them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for our system that makes sense for the reasons I talked about
Hmm.
before. I think you need to ingrain in them the strategy that they're trying to achieve, and then the tactics and the techniques that we use to achieve that strategy, right?
Yeah.
Then
Yep.
then introduce like how ground grappling.
Yep. But by that same token, just to give something to compare that to, we also teach defense against a weapon like a knife or a stick or a firearm, and I teach that much, much, much later in terms of a requirement. Yet again, they will see it probably several times in the course of their training
Mhm.
as part of the regular classroom drills. Hey, we're going to work on this tonight. And then probably 2.5, 3 years into their training, it becomes an intense focus.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
The difference there, I would say, is they've been working on those weapon defense techniques the whole time. They just don't know.
Right. They
Right.
just don't know it.
The
Right.
fundamentals are still there, right?
Right. That
Yeah,
is kind of the magic trick there. We teach them how to fight against a weapon,
yeah,
but then it becomes, oh, hey, guess what? You've been doing this all along.
yeah, right.
Yep.
So, but you need the fundamentals to get to a certain point before you introduce the increased level of difficulty.
Yep. Yep. It's one thing to deal with somebody who grabs you by the shirt. It's another to try to deal with a knife wielding maniac, even if you are using the same defensive tactic.
Right. Exactly.
Yep. One's got a higher price to pay.
I can't hardly believe it here, but I hear in the virtual um, music playing, the Emmy Award music playing in the background that's telling us we've had about enough time and it's it's time to move on. So I think there's so much on this. Actually, a couple things on this topic I thought we'd get to that we didn't. Maybe we can cover this again sometime in the future. I think it would be interesting to talk about the where did these ground grappling systems come from? Their roots in the martial arts. If we do a martial arts history episode in the
Oh
future.
God. Well, that's going to open us up to getting yelled
Yeah.
at by people because I'm gonna lay out the history as I know it, which is all I can do is tell the truth as I know it. As our one of our favorite shared characters says, many of the truths we cling to are dependent upon our own point of view. Um, but somebody else is going to come out with their vision and yell at us because we're wrong.
No,
Um,
I know, and the teaser, I guess, folks, for when we talk about it, I just want to make sure everybody learned about these ground grappling fighting systems in the '90s and early 2000s from the UFC, but
they're much older.
they're much older than these Gracie guys
They do in fact
revolutionized
call
it.
it they do in fact call it Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Well, the word Jiu-Jitsu is not
Yeah,
Portuguese. Okay, it's not. It's not the language it comes from, and they
exactly.
didn't just come up with that name because.
Yeah,
Okay, it's
there's
literally comes from
yeah,
Jiu-Jitsu.
certainly they revolutionized it, but they did not
Yep.
create it from thin air. So.
No. No.
Yeah. So anyway, that's great. I would also like to ask address a small elephant in the room for those. There are a lot of people who only know me through the podcast. Notice maybe that I no longer have my beard. It was a sad day earlier this week when I finally had to shave it because of my day job. Um, so a moment of silence, I guess, for my lost beard. But this is actually the normal me. This is how I used to spend most of my life until the COVID times. I went into lockdown, didn't have to shave anymore. just wanted to call that out. Do me a favor though, and comment. What should I grow it back or not? Hear what everybody who's listening about.
It was so funny when we got on before we started recording. I didn't think anything of it. When I looked directly at you, and I've known you for so long. This is Brian. That is you. It
Yeah,
didn't until Tam said something about you being cold and making a joke. It didn't even really occur to me, and then I'm like, oh well, shit, yeah, that beard is gone. Yeah.
that's true. So, all right. Well, thanks everybody for watching.
Hey, what's our topic next week?
We are going to talk about martial arts stereotypes next week.
Ooh.
So we've talked about similar things in the past, but got some good. I think we've got some good ground to cover there.
I've got some good thumbnail suggestions for that one.
Oh, excellent. See that. So yeah, everybody, give us a like, give us a subscribe, share us with your friends, leave some comments, ask us questions, give us ideas for comments. We need all that stuff. And, we certainly appreciate you listening, and we're looking forward to tuning in again next week.
Yep. Thanks a lot.